Thanks very much, David, for that excellent explanation of what your book's about and how cogent your argument is on so many levels. I have been dealing for the last 5 years of my life, almost obsessively, I probably don't need the almost in that, with the latest war, the war on terror, which is, you know, that's an innovation in terms of the way this one has been described. And, you know, I'm not so foolish as to imagine that there haven't been all kinds of terrible atrocities throughout American imperial history before. But this has a novel twist on it as well, in the sense that that what this war has involved, certainly at its iconic heart, if not as the whole structure, has been this offshore prison on a small piece of Cuba that was stolen over a century ago, and that could be used as an excuse, or in the hope that US lawyers and US courts would get nowhere near it, because the actual ultimate sovereignty of the place belongs to Cuba. But every single decision about what happens there is in the hands of the US government. So I've been dealing with those men who have been taken there, who have been subjected to one startling innovation, I think, really, which is that people seized during wartime have not been held as prisoners of war and protected by the Geneva Conventions. It's at the very heart of the dangerous phoniness of the war on terror that soldiers did not have rights under the Geneva Conventions, and that the other aspect of the war that doesn't work is that a criminal activity such as the terrible terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 is a criminal activity. It's not an act of war, and those people are criminals. And yet what has happened since January the 11th, 2002, when Guantanamo opened, is that the 779 men who have been held there throughout the total of the prison's history were deliberately held by the Bush administration as human beings with no rights whatsoever, enemy combatants, even though what they actually were terrorist suspects who should have been tried in federal court, or soldiers who should have been held as prisoners of war and protected by the Geneva Conventions. So all my work really has been about trying to expose that, has been about trying to tell the stories of the men who are held in an attempt to rehumanize them, or humanize them in the first place, as the entire policy has been to declare that they're the worst of the worst, as the Bush administration did, that they would gnaw through the hydraulic cables of the planes that were bringing them into Cuba if that were possible, which General Richard Myers said. And I think it would be appropriate just to spend a few minutes explaining where we're at now, on the eve of the 9th anniversary of the prison opening, the start of the 10th year of operations at Guantanamo. That there are 173 men left there. So, okay, that's good. 599 men have been released. 6 died throughout the prison's history. Another man came to New York and was put on trial. But the 173 men who remain, I'm very deeply concerned about. I would like to, obviously 2 years ago, when President Obama came into office, I would have liked to have thought that I wouldn't be able to be here tonight talking to you unless it was about the history of Guantanamo, the past. But that didn't happen, and it didn't close after a year as he promised. And sadly, as we approach the midway part of Obama's term in office, it looks very likely that without some kind of concerted action by the concerned citizens here in Baltimore and elsewhere in the country, very few of the 173 people who are still held will be going anywhere in the foreseeable future. And just to explain briefly who they are, President Obama established what he called the Guantanamo Review Task Force, which involved sober and careful career officials from the government departments and from the intelligence agencies to go through the files of all the men held to decide what should be done with them. Now, the result of that is that of the 173 men still held, the government said 89 of them should be released from Guantanamo. So remember that every time you read the stories of, still the right-wing stories about all the terrorists in Guantanamo. Over half of the people who are still there, the government says it doesn't want to hold. So why are they still there? Well, they're still there because 58 of them are Yemenis. And if you remember, on Christmas Day 2009, a Nigerian man tried to blow up his underwear in a plane. He was apparently recruited in Yemen. So as a result of the backlash, President Obama issued a moratorium on releasing any Yemeni prisoners from Guantanamo. So these 58 men who, on the one hand, the government has said it wants to release, have all been prevented from leaving. That's been in place for a year. There is no sign of when, if ever, that moratorium will come to an end. So these people are held because of guilt by nationality. They're held under a form of collective punishment. They are, I believe it is appropriate to say, political prisoners. There are 31 other men in Guantanamo cleared for release. The majority of those can't be freed because it's not safe for them to return to their home countries. Now, the State Department is trying to find new countries for some of these men. I don't know whether enough countries will be found. I find it very disappointing that everybody in a position of authority in this country has refused to allow cleared prisoners who can't be safely repatriated to come and live in the United States, the country responsible for imprisoning them in the first place. Every branch of the government has acted to stop that happening. The Justice Department, the DC Circuit Court, Congress, and President Obama himself, when he turned down a plan by White House counsel Greg Craig in the first few months of his presidency to bring two guys to live in the United States. He backed down on that because he was getting criticism from Republicans. It would have been the biggest, most significant way of showing as a lie the propaganda and distortions of the Bush administration if a couple of non-terrorists, cleared prisoners, had been allowed to come and live here. And people would have been able to see that huge mistakes were made in the rounding up of people at Guantanamo, and that they were certainly not all terrorists at all. But it didn't happen. I think that you know, there's a good moral case to be made for American people to say to their government, we think it appropriate to bring cleared prisoners who can't be repatriated to live here. And if you're interested in that, there's a group called No More Guantanamos, which you can check out, and they've passed a town resolution in Amherst, Massachusetts, saying we want to take cleared prisoners from Guantanamo, and asking Congress people to remove their ban on doing so. So just very quickly again, the last people who are in there, 33 of the men still held are supposed to face trials according to the task force. Well, the Obama administration has found that federal court trials don't play very well with Republicans because they, of course, want these people not accused of terrorism not to be criminals but to be warriors, the foundational myth of the war on terror. They've also found that the military commissions, which were revived by Dick Cheney in November 2001 and have stumbled on in a really dismal manner ever since, and have been revived on a number of occasions by Congress, which were brought back by President Obama as well. They found that they don't play very well with progressives and liberals. And that would be because it's a shambolic second-tier judicial system which most recently delivered the most horrendous ruling in the case of a former child prisoner who was obliged to sign a plea deal saying that he was an alien, unprivileged enemy belligerent, and as such there was no way that he was allowed to be in a position of combat with US soldiers under any circumstances. The Obama administration has presided over a situation where a former child prisoner was in a situation where he was in a criminalized war situation. He was not allowed to be in a war situation against the United States. So these 33 guys are going nowhere. The Obama administration has given up. It's not going to hold trials for anybody. Again, I think this makes them political prisoners. And the last people are 48 men who, this time round, the task force actually specifically stated, we think these guys should continue to be held indefinitely without charge or trial. Because they're too dangerous to release, but we don't have evidence that would stand up in either a federal court or a military commission. That means, guys, that's not evidence. That's some kind of hearsay. And when you know about the history of Guantanamo, you realize that most of that hearsay comes from prisoners who were not being treated very kindly when the statements that the government relies on were extracted from them in the first place. President Obama is apparently close to being given an executive order by his minions in which he will formalize the detention of these 48 men, but guarantee them some kind of review process. I think there is a kind of review process in place. It's called their habeas corpus petitions in the district court in Washington, D.C. I think some of these 48 men have lost their habeas corpus petitions, and that other ones are waiting to have those petitions heard. I think the ones who've lost them were found to be soldiers. They're not terrorists. They were found to have been low-level foot soldiers with the Taliban. And yet, because of these whole problems that we have with these definitions of the war on terror, then the President apparently thinks it's appropriate to keep on holding them indefinitely without charge or trial, as essentially enemy combatants, or alien unprivileged enemy belligerents, as they now are. And I must stop, because otherwise I'm going to go on forever. Thank you very much.
Apologies, Ms. Coons, bring Andy here.